Hello, my name is Lineke and I'm presenting to you my permaculture design project for the Deloro farmhouse in Marmora, Ontario, Canada. As a naturopathic doctor, I have a great appreciation for holistic whole system design and for the ecosystems we are part of and those we co-create. Therefore, I felt immediately very in my element with the permaculture principles and teachings. I'm also on a journey to transition to a more regenerative lifestyle, which involves community and working more closely with land and growing food. So this is the motivation that spurred me to start this course. I don't have land myself, though, and therefore I reached out to a couple in Ontario. Meet Emily and Brandon and their 2 boys and 2 dogs who left the busy city of Toronto 4 years ago to go and live on this home farm where they have been slowly developing the farm, and they welcomed my help and the addition of permaculture design to their project. The land is rather large with 108 acres, which is indicated by the red lines on this map, of mostly rocky, hilly land. The area in yellow is what I have focused on for the permaculture design, and this is mostly the area that Brandon and Emily would like to develop. The remaining area, at least for now, is going to remain forest and wildland. So these are Emily and Brandon's goals for the next 10 years. And so the short-term goals for the first year are to design the kitchen garden, to increase the water catchment near the vegetable garden so that they can water the garden all year around, and build up the soil, especially on those rocky areas with very thin layer of soil. In the next 3 years, the goal is to grow a forest garden, which will develop around the old apple trees on the land. And also they want to introduce livestock, sheep and goat, start a beehive, and add a ground cover to attract more pollinators and improve the soil and the ecosystem. The 6-year goals are to continue to get the land and the area and to see where it leads them. And in 10 years, they are hoping to produce enough food to feed multiple families and also to share the land or even return it to the indigenous people. So here again, the site map showing the full property as well as the area that I'm focusing on for the permaculture design in yellow. And here is the base map, which shows that there is ample of water on the land in the form of streams, ponds. There's a larger lake just north of the base map from where the water flows down. And then there are several buildings and structures, which we will all go into much more detail in the next slides. So on this map, you can see the various zones. On the very outside, the light blue lines indicate Zone 5, Wilderness Zone, as I already explained. This will not be part of this permaculture design, but it is good to know that that is the purpose of this land, to stay wild. And then Zone 1 to 4 are illustrated in this overview. So you can see that Zone 1 is mostly around the house, used food preservation, rain catchment, and socializing in the backyard. And in zone 2, there is a kitchen garden, chickens, and a compost. Zone 3 is currently mostly grassland, and the idea is to develop this and use it for the future livestock. And zone 4 is currently where the old apple trees and maple bushes grow, around which a food forest will be developed. And here is a close-up of zone 1 and 2, just to give a little better view. You can see the major pathways lead from the house to the parking area, and from the parking area to the compost. Those are pathways that are walked on a daily basis, and therefore provide an opportunity to plant bushes and trees that need some daily attention, like berries, for example, that can be picked while walking along the path. And here are the sectors, which shows that the areas where the food grows, so the fruit trees and the vegetable garden, have year-long sun exposure. And the wind mostly comes from the west, and there is a little bit of a windbreak there from the trees, but the wind still can get pretty strong and cause damage to the house and the trees around the house. I'll talk more about the sectors in the next slide. So these, we already spoke about wind and sun. There's also some potential exposure to toxins, primarily from the neighbors that spray their lawns, which causes concern for the contamination of the stream, and therefore they are not using the stream to water plants. And there is a wildlife sector, which includes predators, which are a threat to the chickens, so they need protection with a fence and a coop. And they also enjoy the company of deer that pass through and whom they share their apples. Here's an overview of the water systems, and as well as the topography. The land, as I said, is quite hilly, and the biggest hill is right in the center here. During the winter, this is used for sledding, and water tends to pool underneath this hill. The sunny side tends to get rather dry and hot in the summer, whereas there's also a shady side, which is where, for example, the snow sticks around during the winter. So the hills have quite an effect on the microclimates of the land. I already mentioned a bit about all the different water sources. This map also indicates an area that could be used for an additional pond to hold more of the water on the land during the summer, which is where the water naturally pools. And there's also quite some wetlands underneath the slopes where water sits around for longer, but not all summer. So there's still a need to hold on to more water during the long, hot summer months. There's a potential to add more rain barrels to the house to increase the water reserves, which can then be used for the kitchen garden. Exactly how many rain barrels can be calculated by calculating the roof size. This map shows that the immediate neighbors are indicated here in yellow. This is also where the concern for contamination is coming from. And then there is also a lot of agriculture and mining happening in the area, and extraction of minerals, again, posing some potential threats for toxins. And so there is, it is recommended to get the soil tested on a seasonal basis and to rely more on water catchment rather than the river. And also to potentially get involved in on a political level and in the management of these toxins. So I will now share my assessment of the plants, trees, gardens on the next slide. First of all, there is the kitchen garden, in which Brandon and Emily are growing a combination of perennials and annuals. And the design is mostly in parallel rows, which helps to access all the vegetables easily. There's quite some weeds growing in the vegetable gardens, and they're trying to prevent this with landscaping material, as well as they have had some pests bothering the asparagus and the zucchini, namely the red beetle and the striped cucumber beetle. So there are some opportunities here to rebalance the ecosystem, manage the pests and the weeds, which will all be discussed in the implementation section. Zone 3 and 4 display a great variety of wildflowers, offering lots of choice for pollinators, which is beautiful. Zone 3 also still has a lot of grass though, which depletes the soil from nutrients, and the soil would benefit from adding more floral ground cover such as clover to help retain nutrients and fix nitrogen, and also balance out and keep the weeds away. These are the old apple trees, of which there are about 20 in Zone 4. They are approximately 100 years old, and they offer great potential to start a food forest with mature trees rather than having to start from scratch. They are quite tall right now, which brings the apples out of reach, so they would benefit from some pruning. And once the plants are added to the food forest, this will help balance out the whole ecosystem and also improve the health of the apple trees and the quality of the apples. And soil. As I said, the terrain is rather rocky, and there are large areas where the soil is very thin and mostly rocky, especially in zones 3 and 4. The soil around the house seems thicker and less rocky, and this is also where there is a lush green lawn and a kitchen garden. But zone 3 and 4 would benefit from adding some layers of topsoil in order to grow more on the land. And then the built environment. First of all, there is the main house where the family lives. This is mostly used for socializing, food preservation, maple syrup production, working, and could also potentially be used for rain catchment and solar panels. The chicken coop is already used for rain catchment, and features one big rain barrel, which is used for the chickens. And of course, it's also used for a home for the chickens, the egg production, and harvesting chicken manure. And some other of the structures on the land are the barn, which is in good condition and it's currently used for storage, could potentially be used for animals during the winter once they bring more livestock on the land. Then there's a shed which is not in a good condition and it's currently not being used, but could potentially be repaired and used for storage as well. The maple syrup production buildings, which are on the borders of zone 3 and 4, they need restoring, but there are already creative ideas on how these buildings can be used, which include maple syrup production, growing of seedlings, but also music production and other creative uses. Regarding the social and invisible structures, what is mostly challenging currently for Brandon and Emily is that the farmers' community is rather conservative and it's difficult for them to form meaningful connections and collaborate with like-minded people. Even though they feel that there must be others like them, they don't really know where to find them and how to connect to them and how to find each other. There is definitely an opportunity here to form partnerships with local people. And since Brandon and Emily are very interested in indigenous cultures and the preservation of these cultures, and even sharing their land with the indigenous people, there's an opportunity there to bring more helping hands to the land and start collaborating already, since time and energy are one of the scarce resources that they currently have and could use more of. So if they are able to form those relationships, it would help to reach their goals. Animals, waste, and nutrient cycles. Emily and Brandon are already good at recycling their food scraps, of which most of it goes to the compost. There's also a lot of yard waste on the land that could be used towards the formation of hugelkultur mounds, and it presents a great opportunity to create lots of nutritious soils for the garden by organizing this. Especially big logs and tree branches can be used towards this purpose. Regarding water, most of the gray and black water goes through the septic system with weeping tiles, which are covered by the lawn on the west side of the house. A separate gray water system could divert the wastewater to the garden and save some of this water. And also the lawn clippings can be used towards compost and mulch. And finally, animal waste. The chicken manure can be used as a fertilizer or mulch, and the dog waste can also be added to the compost. Implementation phase. For the first 2 years, my recommendations are to improve the soil quality and quantity by making best use of locally available resources. So I already referred to the hugelkultur mounds that can be created in zones 3 and 4 using the larger biomass such as logs and tree branches, but also municipal resources like, for example, collecting manure from the farms, food scraps from the restaurants, wood chips locally, sawdust, leaves, etc. Anything that can be sourced locally and that can help to build up this soil faster. In addition, I would recommend creating a separate worm composting buckets for extra nutrient-rich soil. Secondly, in order to protect zone 1 and 2 from the wind, I would recommend building up the wind shields with trees, by staggering layers of wind protection on the west and northwest side with fast-growing evergreens that are suitable for Zone 5. Thirdly, to increase the water catchment, especially to improve conditions during the long and dry summers, and to have access to water all year around for watering the plants. I would recommend adding a pond where the water collects naturally, and Brandon has already been looking at this, as well as calculating roof catchment so that it can be decided how much rainwater can be harvested by adding more rain barrels. And lastly, for this phase, I will discuss a few methods to reduce pests and weeds in the vegetable garden by balancing the ecosystem. This map shows where to implement the steps that I discussed on the previous slides. So here it shows where the water pools to add the pond. Zone 3 and 4 are great for hugelkultur mounds. And on here on the west side would be a good spot for a windshield. Regarding the reducing of damaging insects, the key principles are to create habitats for beneficial animals, to create balanced ecosystems, because the fact that these insects are there are merely a symptom of an underlying cause, which is an ecosystem that is out of balance or can be more balanced. Companion planting and biodiversity can also help with this, and improving soil quality can improve the health of the plants and make them less susceptible to damaging insects. In specifically, I will discuss the three insects that create the biggest hazard. The first one being mosquitoes, and especially closer to the house where the people spend a lot of time sitting outside. I would recommend growing aromatic herbs that keep mosquitoes away, and I'm listing a few examples here. Then the second one is the red beetle, which has been bothering the asparagus. So several ways to deal with this include attracting birds and beneficial insects, especially ladybugs. And there are ways to attract these insects, for example, by adding shallow water sources and particular flowers, and even a ladybug house, so that these beneficial insects can then keep the damaging insects in check. Lastly, some of the ways to keep the striped cucumber beetle in check include attracting natural predators such as spiders, ground beetles, and bats, as well as some organic cultural controls such as crop rotation, the use of transplants rather than direct seeding, mulching for predator conservation, choosing resistant varieties, and intercropping. Here are a few recommendations for reducing the weeds in the vegetable beds. The first one would be to replace the landscaping material with mulch, because mulch has several purposes, and the dried grass clippings from the lawn are already available for this. Can also be used, leaves can also be used, but mulch will not only help with the weeds, but it will also reduce the need to water, improve the soil quality, prevent erosion, and provide habitats for beneficial insects that can then again help to keep the damaging insects away. So mulching covers a lot of different purposes. The second recommendation is to fill the niches and to try to understand why do the weeds occur and what is it a symptom of. For example, compacted soil. Implementation phase 2 for the next 2 to 5 years. in order to continue to develop the regenerative farm while optimizing the use of human and other resources, I recommend that once the soil has built, to get it tested and to perform water and soil testing on a seasonal basis. And then start growing the food forest based on the apple tree guilds, which I will illustrate on the next slides. Prune the apple trees to improve the apple quality, replace the grass with a ground cover that attracts more beneficial insects and has a bunch of other benefits. Increase the perennials by using methods that help avoid having to start from seed every summer and to continue building on what was grown the previous year. And also increase the interactions between the various components. I already mentioned plant berries along the major paths. The chickens can be brought into the food forest and veggie garden to help with the problem of insects. The edges around the ponds can be used, etc., etc. So this slide explains how to create a food forest, and specifically a food forest built around apple trees. And this is an illustration of an example of an apple tree guild, which outlines plants and bushes that go really well with the apple tree. And lastly, implementation phase 3. Once the plants have grown, it is a good time to introduce the livestock for rotational grazing, and Brandon and Emily have indicated they would like to have sheep and goat on the land. Also, they would like to start a beehive, which would be perfect in zone 3 or 4, ideally facing southeast and keeping the bees sheltered from wind, water, and full-on sun exposure. And then to maintain the food forest and create a system to have vegetables all year around. And ultimately, within the next 10 years or so, the land would produce enough food to feed multiple families without having a lot of work for it. So the beauty about the food forest is that once it is there, it largely maintains itself. And to also start sharing the land with other families and even potentially, eventually return it to local indigenous people. So this concludes my presentation. I hope you found it beneficial and educational, and that this can be used towards the future permaculture projects.